Welcome to the last of the lectures in the Connected series. Today I'm going to be talking about connected knowledge and how that interconnectivity, both of living organisms and our knowledge about them, has been brought to light over many centuries through writers and travelers, using books, their personal stories, and then ultimately now in the world of open science, how we use the internet and exchange information at the press of a button. Over this journey, we're going to bump into some incredible people who've been able to generate not only their own stories on paper, but to create in people's minds what the rest of the world has looked like. And through this, we're going to see how slowly ideas about how the planet operates has really brought together knowledge from all the distant corners of the world. And it's been that knowledge that has brought together not only our understanding, but also communities of scientists, communities of amateurs, who contributed to the corpus, the body of knowledge that we have about the world that we live in and actually what our future might look like. So let me start then with one of potentially the most famous of travelers, Marco Polo. Marco Polo was born in the 13th century in Venice, and after some time he went with his uncle and his uncle's and his father, Niccolò and Maffeo. They set off on what must have been an epic journey at that time to Asia. They explored many places along this Silk Road until they reached Cathay, China. The Polo family appears to have been very shrewd, alert and courageous. They met many people on their travels as they traveled these vast distances. They created diplomatic and business links, and they met leaders such as Berke Khan, sovereign of the Western Territories in the Mongol Empire. And eventually they met the great Kublai Khan. They were received by the royal court, and Kublai Khan was really impressed with Marco Polo, with his intelligence, but also with his humility. And because of that, he actually appointed him to do many things for his court. First of all, he became a foreign emissary. And under that guise, he met people throughout the empire in Southeast Asia, the current present-day Burma, Myanmar, India, Indonesia, Sri Lanka, and Vietnam. But as part of his appointment, he was also traveling extensively inside China, living in the emperor's lands for 17 years and seeing many things that had previously been unknown to Europeans. Now, after some time, Marco Polo, with his father and uncle, returned to Venice, on the way delivering the Princess Cocochin to Persia. And before they left, Kublai Khan had asked him to go to Pisa to meet the Pope and ask him to send him 100 intelligent men acquainted with the 7 arts. Anyway, arriving in Venice after 24 years, they found that the city was at war with Genoa, and Marco Polo was immediately imprisoned. But there he dictated his stories to Rustichello da Pisa. He was a cellmate. And these were published when he came out as Il Milione, which he intended to be this vast cosmography based on his first-hand experiences, really trying to capture this panoramic view of the world that he had with this powerful wide-angle lens. Now, in the last millennium, of course, the influence of individual books was enormous, and it really opened up society's understanding of the world. And even though Marco Polo wasn't the first European to travel to China, he was actually the first one to explore some parts and to chronicle those experiences. So his account of the Orient is what provided Europeans with a clear picture of the geography, the ethnic customs, the animals, the plants, paper money, for example, coal, gunpowder, and porcelain. It was the first Western record of porcelain. So a huge literature built up around Marco Polo's writings. And you can genuinely say that he influenced so many things, including European cartography, and including the introduction of the Frau Mauro map. Now, when we think about explorers, we also think of scientists. And it is very, very clear that as the world began to open up, more and more individuals became interested in describing and documenting the living world. In other words, it was kind of science on the run. Now, there was a lot of competition amongst instrument makers and amongst scientists. And I want to just introduce you to someone who is one of my favorites, who I've been writing about for some time, Edmund Wingate. He's not in the forefront of much of the science as we know it, but what he actually had under his belt was a good training. He went to Oxford, and then he became the tutor for Queen Henrietta, as she was to be, having got married to Charles I. And in the French court, he really appreciated how much knowledge and science was being done. So Henry IV of France, who was Henrietta's father, really nurtured this idea of knowledge and science within his court. And of course, she was a Medici, so that brought another tradition into the French court. Now, whilst Wingate was there, he was encouraged, he was her mathematics tutor, but he was encouraged to do his own work. And he was really interested in measurement. He'd actually been, he'd seen a copy, I think, he didn't have an original set of Napier's rods, the logarithmic rods. And so whilst he was in the court, he developed effectively the first prototype of the slide rule. He made one, even as far as we can tell, but then to all intents and purposes, and from his own reports, it appears that it got stolen and taken to the south of France. Anyway, Wingate goes back to England. He travels as Henrietta becomes the wife of Charles I. But to his horror, he discovered that someone else had not only got the plan and the ideas, but had actually started to claim that he was the maker of the first slide rule. This was William Oughtred. So there was a tremendous kind of competition where one was decrying the other, one said they were copying, and so on. So these ideas of combining what were then the Gunther rules into a slide rule was really, really hotly contested because, of course, it made a lot of calculations much easier than it had been in the past. So this is to say that scientific competition was alive and well. And what it really led to, in a sense, was this idea that patronage sort of created a patenting environment, an intellectual property environment, because, of course, your patron did not want to see the ideas that they paid for, in a sense, taken over by somebody else. So there was a lot of competition between scientists, between investigators, but also between the patrons themselves. Now, Wingate went on to do some quite extraordinary things, but hardly noticed within the larger picture of the global science community as we talk about it. He was, in a sense, an amateur. But he produced something fascinating, which was a book called Of Natural and Artificial Arithmetic. It came out in 2 parts, and there were a lot of additions to it. And essentially, he started to talk about logarithms, but it had within it the making of how farmers and those who own assets can really keep track of off-book assets. And ironically, of course, this is exactly what happened during the Enron scandals and what happened, of course, when the bank collapse happened. So when we can genuinely see changes, we can often see that behind it has been a phenomenal development of instrumentation as well. The great expeditions of the last 4 centuries have really relied on instruments, as well as the drive for discovering new lands and for investment. And that was the really core of this, was that navigators really needed to know where they were. They needed to know and to be accurate at sea, out of sight of land. Now, you could always determine latitude, because you could measure the sun's angle at noon, or in the northern hemisphere, to measure the angle of Polaris from the horizon during twilight. But to find longitude was a lot harder, because you needed to have a standard time that would work on board a ship. So effectively using celestial motions, as Galileo had done, simply didn't work. And now there began an enormous effort which brought us tremendous innovation. So the use of the chronometer was really put forward as a way to explore the world. So starting out in about 1530, Gemma-Frisius was really the first one to propose the use of a chronometer. Many scientists and engineers got involved, and it was chosen to have a fixed point, a fixed location where time would be set. And this is where Greenwich Mean Time comes from. And it's extremely important for navigation, because once you've set that, you can then, as a navigator, use the time difference between where you are and GMT to determine the ship's longitude. So that's because the Earth rotates at a regular rate. The difficulty is, of course, trying to keep time when you're on a moving platform. So planets don't really work, and many other things was tried. The engineers had all kinds of chronometer ideas of pendulums and all sorts. There were kings involved. For example, Huygens, he made a first attempt at the marine chronometer in 1673 in France. He was sponsored and eventually got a pension from Louis XIV. And he invented one which had a balance wheel and a spiral spring for regulation instead of this pendulum. But that really is what opened up the world and the way to thinking about marine chronometers and modern pocket watches, in fact, and wristwatches. But it still proved to be a problem. So he and Robert Hooke, who also claimed to have conceived of this spring-driven clock years before, they all tried to get these things patented. And they went to King Charles, but none of them worked well enough, and so they never received a patent, certainly not in England. Then more people tried, Sully and Thacker. They had different models to try to resist the rolling of the seas and trying to keep precise time. By 1714, the British government were really wanting to solve the problem, and so they offered a prize, the Longitude Prize as it became known. It was a lot of money, 2 to 4 million in today's terms, pounds, and so that range depended on the accuracy. And who came forward was a Yorkshire carpenter, John Harrison, and he submitted a project in 1730, and he completed a clock based on a pair of counter-oscillating weighted beams, and they were connected by springs, but whose motion was not influenced by gravity or the motion of the ship. Now, his first two steam timepieces, H1 and H2 as they became known, were not very accurate, and they had a fundamental sensitivity to centrifugal force, which meant that, of course, if the ship was rocking, then the clock wouldn't keep very accurate time. But eventually, he created an idea of bimetallic strips and a caged roller with caged roller bearings. And so what this meant was that as the ship moved, essentially the clock would keep still. So his H3 circular balances was good, but the last one, the H4, which he produced in 1761, it pretty much looks like a large pocket watch, really did the business. And he submitted it for the prize. Now, his design was taken out, it was tested, and on board the Aurora in 1767, and for that he did receive the prize. So this was a tremendous breakthrough because it meant that wherever ships went, wherever explorers went, they could usually report back very accurately where they had been. So having got time and place, we now go back to looking at instruments that really opened up our knowledge of the planet at every single scale. So we had telescopes, but the real breakthrough came when I think Leeuwenhoek produced a microscope. Now, he was an interesting man, Philips van Leeuwenhoek. He was a businessman. He became known as the father of microbiology, and he was one of the first people to really be able to process glass in a very particular way that gave him the idea of putting a small rod of soda lime glass in a hot flame. And what he was able to do then was to pull the hot section apart to create two long whiskers of glass. And then he would reinsert the end of one whisker into the flame, and he could create a very small, high-quality glass sphere. And these spheres became the lenses for his microscopes. So he became very famous with this. He started to then use them to explore what we now know to be called microbial life. He was the first one to experiment with microbes, and he gave them names that they were called dierkens or diergens, small animals. In English, we called them animalcules, so tiny animals. Anyway, through his experiments, he was really the first to determine their size, and we now know that these were unicellular. So he observed both unicellular and multicellular organisms from pond water. And he was really the first one to document a whole variety of tissues, muscle fibers, bacteria, spermatozoa, red blood cells, crystals, blood flow and capillaries. So what Leeuwenhoek's work did using this instrument was to effectively open up a whole new world that was beyond the sight of men and women. But he was very reluctant to publish his findings. He was a businessman. He didn't have any scientific background, very little kind of experience. And so by the time he died, pretty much all of his work was captured in letters. So what he did was he actually wrote letters to the Royal Society detailing his findings. And he then kind of wrote them in colloquial Dutch. So effectively, he'd never seen a paper written in Latin, and he was the last one to start writing in Latin. So it took quite some time to get these translated, and it was eventually done by a man called Henry Oldenburg. And he learnt Dutch for this very purpose. So the sort of renowned experiments of Leeuwenhoek eventually sort of hit the newsstands. And of course, at that time, some of his credibility was questioned because no one could really believe this. I mean, the existence of single-cell organisms was completely unknown. Anyway, eventually, he was considered to become labeled as a reliable observer. And although they were met with skepticism, his observations eventually became part of the kind of Royal Society's theories. And effectively, those observations meant that Leeuwenhoek was actually appointed as a fellow of the Royal Society just before he died. In fact, he was taken aback by the nomination because not only did he consider it a high honour, but he never even had attended any meeting of the Royal Society. So we can see from people like Leeuwenhoek, who came at science through an amateur process, through a business process, that knowledge was accumulating kind of everywhere. And instrument makers became a very crucial part of this landscape. And it was sort of happening all over the place. So in Germany, Brander became one of the most important scientific instrument makers. He could produce glass scales on which millimeters were divided up into 30 equal parts, so you could do accurate measurement. And there was a whole catalogue of different kinds of instruments at that time, about 100, more than 100, which really covered all the needs of natural sciences. And then there was another person who became very famous, Joseph von Fraunhofer, after which the Fraunhofer Institutes are named. And his work was really about creating pure, defect-free optical glass. And he could manufacture that into lenses, to achromatic lenses and prisms. So this again opened up an entire field. Of course, Newton and others made great use of all of this. And more importantly, it led to the discovery of the dark lines in the solar spectrum that bears his name. Now, Fraunhofer then, of course, built an entire legacy of how to make instruments for science, and that was picked up by others. So, for example, Giuseppe Pedazzi, he was the director of the Palermo Astronomical Observatory, and that observatory had the most up-to-date instruments that he could get. He had instruments brought in from Jesse Ramsden, from London, and many others. And these instruments survived right literally up until the present day through the careful sort of maintenance in this Baroque observatory dome inside a monastery in Bavaria. So all over Europe, this capacity to do science was increasing because as scientific instruments were being made and they were being sold, people's curiosity began to pick up. And then eventually, although it took quite some time until the middle of the 19th century, this idea of using scientific instrumentation was brought into the teaching world so that students were actually then able to use not just or just to look at pictures, but could actually put their hands onto instruments themselves. And so the work of someone called Bennett, who was in Edinburgh at the time, was really helping to transform this. And he brought the scientific toy into first-rate research instruments. So students were using them, researchers were using them, and so, of course, it became part of the way that we could then make detailed observations of the world. Now, if we look at how the world has been described, natural history has been with us for a very long time. But let's go back to the 18th century. One of the most important, potentially, cataloguers of nature is Carl Linnaeus. He's Swedish. He was a botanist, zoologist, taxonomist. In fact, he really became known as the father of taxonomy. Now, why was that? Well, he spent a lot of time on the farm in natural worlds. He was a very gifted and brilliant student. He would write in Latin, for example. And through his observations, going into the countryside, looking for plants, he came out of school at the age of 15 as pretty much a professional botanist. And then he met a person called Rothman, another Swede, who then expanded his interest into medicine, so that by the age of 17, he was really well acquainted with not only the botanical literature, but also all the books that were being produced at that time, but also on some of the more interesting processes like sexual reproduction and so forth. So he was a notable young person. And at that time, he was brought to the university. He was only 17. He was in the second year, and he started to give lectures. They were really popular, and he often addressed big audiences, 300 people, for example, on all sorts of topics to do with taxonomy, but before he had called it that, but really trying to understand the natural system. But then he went off and he started traveling. He went abroad for quite a number of years. He lived abroad and he studied plants, but particularly he wanted to look at medicine and botany. And so he went on journeys through Sweden, looking and finding and classifying plants and animals. And he continued all through his life connecting to minerals and to essentially to the ecosystems where he was. And he wrote a lot about this. In fact, he was really called the Pliny of the North, considered not only the father of taxonomy, but also one of the founders of modern ecology, because he could not only contextualize the plants and animals that he was describing and then put them into this binomial classification which he invented, but he could also then talk about why certain plants and animals were found in different places. In fact, what's interesting about Linnaeus is that his own body, when he died, remains the type specimen for Homo sapiens because he was the sole specimen that he's known to have examined was in fact himself. So under the International Code of Zoological Nomenclature, he is the one. But the turning point for Linnaeus happened when he went up to Lapland. And he literally had a moment of inspiration. He'd got a grant from the Royal Society of Sciences, and his idea was to undertake an expedition and to literally create a botanical and ornithological manuscript. He found huge quantities of different plants. I think he described more than 100 plants that had never been identified before, and this gave him the Flora Laponica. The flash of insight that came to him was about the classification of mammals, in fact. What he looked at was the jawbone of a horse at the side of the road as he was traveling along. And he said, well, if only I knew how many teeth and what kind every animal had, how many teeth and where they were placed, maybe I could work out a perfectly natural system for the arrangement of all quadrupeds. And then he went on and he started to think about this with his plants. So his account from Lapland contained 534 species in which he put the first binomial classification. And that's where we get the Linnaean system that we use today. So quite often you'll see a species described with the letter L after it. Now, with that classification widely accepted, scientific explorations and expeditions into new lands had a comparative basis upon which to describe and to put knowledge which was being gathered. A very famous person at this time was Comte de Buffon. He was really one of my favorite taxonomists. He described many fishes, which I was studying as part of my own PhD. I was an ichthyologist. But he was a typical person of that time. He was a naturalist, a mathematician, a cosmologist, and an encyclopedist, as he would call himself. And in fact, his works really influenced people like Lamarck and Cuvier and many of the others who came afterwards. So he had 6 quarto volumes of something called Histoire Naturelle. And during his lifetime, he continued to add to that. So truly, people such as Ernst Mayr, a famous 20th century evolutionary biologist, would write that Buffon was truly the father of all thought in natural history in the second half of the 18th century. When he moved to Paris, he got to know many people and many intellectuals like Voltaire and others, and he made his mark in the field of mathematics. on game theory, for example, working on calculus and probability theory. And in fact, the problem of Buffon's needle in probability theory, which is named after him, on the basis of which he was put into the French Academy of Sciences. But the point being is that these individuals were enormous in the world of thinking and science, but they were also very practical. He became, for example, the head of the Parisian Jardin de Roi, and he basically started gardening. He arranged plots of lands, he acquired new botanical and zoological specimens from all over the world, put them into the museum, and that has become one of the most famous museums actually today. Now, as he collected, he noted something important, which was that despite similar environments, different regions have distinct plants and animals. And that concept, which became Buffon's law, was really the principle of biogeography. So we've had Linnaeus as the father of taxonomy. We've had certainly the father of microbiology with Leeuwenhoek. And then we have now Buffon, who's really set out and transformed our ideas of biogeography. So we don't expect to find everything in the same place. And on that basis, really Darwin picked up, and we can see that his work was the precursor to Darwin's ideas. Now, Darwin, when he wrote his fourth edition, he actually acknowledged the gains that he'd had from reading Buffon. But the challenge was that the paradox of Buffon is that he wasn't really an evolutionary biologist. He didn't believe in that. And so he, in a sense, brought attention to biogeography, but he didn't really take it into the realms of evolution. But one thing he did do was to think about the unity of type. And more than anyone else, he was the person who brought the idea of the scale of history of Earth. In fact, he also was the first one to imply that you get your inheritance from parents. And he did this on the basis of looking at elephants and mammoths. But he never really was taken with this idea of a struggle for existence. So although he developed a system of heredity that was very similar to Darwin's hypothesis of pangenesis, he didn't really see that there was any way in which this struggle for life would generate the ideas. Well, it wasn't discussed at that time because, of course, Darwin hadn't done his work, but you could see that wasn't something that he was contemplating. Now, one of the other things was that the sort of the naming, so to speak, of plants and animals was really very important. And it led to what we would see as being perhaps a more upsurge in the ideas of cataloguing, of creating collections. And it was through that people like Solander, who joined James Cook on his expedition, and others, sought money to create museums where people could go and look and explore the natural world, but through order rather than just simply panoramas of where various specimens were just simply placed. So that great tradition of the museums, the Natural History Museum, where scientists would send back their materials, was really started through this combination of people in the early 18th century, from Linnaeus, Solander, Banks, and all these others. So on that basis alone, we then had fundamentally 200 years of expeditions. We had the scientific expeditions of Darwin and Wallace, of Lewis and Clark in the USA, of Livingstone and Stanley, Nansen and Amundsen and Shackleton up in the polar regions, and many, many more people committed to describing the world through scientific lenses, through microscopes, through their own scientific thinking, and really discovering the workings of the planet. It would seem that the world was just filled with people describing. But there was one place and one idea that really captured the imagination of so many people around the world. And it was really the one that excited the same fascination, as you might say, of looking at the hidden side of the moon, the heights of the Himalayas, or even the Antarctic race. But it went one step further, and that was the source of the Nile. So, in fact, only 150 years ago, the matter had become the greatest geographical secret we could describe after the discovery of America. And it was a matter of endless speculation amongst geographers. China became known to Europe, America, Australia were discovered, but still, in the mid-19th century, the center of Africa remained an enigma. And then there was a report back from a man called Johann Redman, who reported that he'd traveled from the coast of East Africa and he'd come upon a snow-capped peak, and this was Kilimanjaro. Then Krapp followed up, and he had found Mount Kenya. Then there were other lakes, Lake Nyanza, Lake Ujiji. So the question was, were these lakes all the same? How did they fit into the pattern of the Nile? And we had then an enormous flurry of interest. So two people, Burton and Speke, set off for Africa in 1856, deciding to see whether if they came in from Zanzibar and went into the dark interior, they might be able to find the source of the Nile. And that's when this kind of a new era of Central African exploration began. Of course, the name that comes to mind is Livingstone. Now, Livingstone, he was still a young man. He was only 52 when he set off on his last journey. And previously, he'd done incredible things. He'd had many discoveries, but many had been a disaster from the perspective of his companions because he wanted to lead. And he had a set idea. And this is one of the problems that we don't often discuss in science because we are pressed again and again to reify, to check our hypotheses and so on. But Livingstone was absolutely stubbornly committed to finding the source of the Nile. And this was to carry him on through his life's work. His plan was to initially come into from the east coast and to go into the unexplored territories south of Lake Tanganyika. He was convinced that this is where the source of the Nile was. For several years, in fact, he disappeared, and his whereabouts became a perennial mystery. People were sent off. The Royal Geographic Society was sent off to go and find him. But eventually, a figure who became world known, a foreign correspondent known as Stanley, pushed his way through when he arrived in a place called Ujiji, because he'd kind of heard that this is where he might be. And he met him, but he was so I would say, morally afraid to approach that he became very formal and said the famous phrase, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume," to which Livingstone replied, "Yes." At the very beginning, this had just been an assignment for Stanley. He was a correspondent, he wanted a good story. But Livingstone needed medicine and news of the world, and Stanley needed kudos. And so together they planned a journey. And they decided to settle one question, which is whether the Ruzizi River was, in fact, the beginning of the Nile, the source of the Nile. So off they went, and nevertheless, they found out that this was wrong. It was the wrong idea. And so they separated, and Stanley set off to the coast to go and to get more reserves and stores. And then he put all of this together in his book. So Stanley met the Royal Geographic Society team on their way to try to find Livingstone and told them, "Oh, no, he's fine. He's okay." And so in a way, he stole the thunder of everyone by going back to New York with all the letters and the correspondence and the journals. And he wrote the book, How I Found Livingstone. So, of course, it came under critical review. But one of the things that Livingstone did whilst he didn't discover the source of the Nile was that he was present at this terrible massacre of Ujijian slaves. And it was on the basis of that sensational report that he had written, which he gave to Stanley, which led eventually to the Sultan of Zanzibar forced to close the slave market forever. So in that sense, his work did a great deal of good. But he was a very stubborn man. And nevertheless, having described many things, it was for others to really put the Nile onto the map. But let me stay in Kenya for a while, or in East Africa, and talk about geography and how much it matters. So we've often thought about landscapes and thought about the plants and the animals. But in 1888, a remarkable chapter opened up with the presence of, for the first time, European explorers in Lake Turkana. It was called Lake Rudolph at that time. They found all kinds of nomadic tribes, of cultures, of language, and so on, and economic systems, mostly based on pastoralism. Now, Count Halecki and his lieutenant, von Herhel, they were trudging northwards, and they found this lake, this mysterious lake, which in fact ended up being known, and it has been recognized as the largest permanent desert lake in the world. So this was very exciting. It was an enormous trek. They brought back bales of rare and valuable specimens to the Imperial Natural History Museum in Vienna, kept the curators working for many, many, many months. But they missed something, because on the shores of Lake Turkana was where the greatest secret remained undiscovered until 1972, when hominin fossils of some of the earliest human ancestors were found in the Turkana Basin. Richard Leakey, now synonymous with the work on hominids begun by his parents, undertook an expedition to Alia Bay, and having seen sediments around the lake shore during a flight to avoid a storm, he wondered whether there was something there. And so he went back and established something called Kubi Fora Camp. And this camp opened up and discovered an amazing series of finds. A skull was found in 1969, the Paranthropus boise. Great excitement. Then there was a Homo erectus skull that was discovered in 1972 and 1975. And then some of these really significant finds began to build up. In 1978, an intact cranium of Homo erectus was found as well. The skull, originally thought to be Homo habilis, it was given the name Homo rudolfensis after the name of the lake, but it truly is an archaic form of hominid. And this caused huge excitement because it meant that from the early Pleistocene, about 2 million years ago, this is where hominids were really working. Now, there were no bodily remains, of course, but soon after, Mary Leakey found a fossil called the Turkana boy, and it was a nearly complete skeleton of a juvenile Homo agaster. It was called Homo habilis, and then after that we saw more and more. We had Homo agaster was found. Maeve Leakey found another skull, 3.5 million years old. So all around this area, we could see the development of hominids. And having been there and seen it, you can understand that much of what effectively was going on through that geographic area were people who could effectively have food, particularly plant. You could see that tools were developed, and the dental anatomy really showed that they were processing plant and meats together. But effectively, it was like the perfect place for hominids to develop. And then further to the south, in Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, then of course even more hominids were found. So this whole area, now obviously linked very much with the Leakey family, was seen to be, in a sense, the core of our knowledge about humans and our own sort of ancestry. And out of that, of course, from much work done by archaeologists, we could see that dispersion of people. Now, of course, since then, hominids have been found in other parts, in Europe, for example, but nevertheless, this was an important part of exploration. As I said, putting places on a chart and documenting what is there has been a fundamental part of connecting scientists and researchers, bringing knowledge together. And so the Theatre of the World, as one of the first catalogue collections is known, really became important. But putting something onto a map flat, given that the world is a globe, is not flat, required a certain skill. And so a surveyor kind of pops up in this story, Gerardus Mercator, 16th century surveyor and cartographer. And his sort of first collection of maps, the epitome of the Theatre of the World, which was produced by his contemporary, captured this idea as to how to make flat maps, which were convenient, you could take on travels, and essentially really transformed the way in which people could view the world. Now, Mercator also went on to create globes, and this was really his business. But his early maps were in these large formats. You could put them on the wall, but in the second part of his life, he produced these smaller maps, which you could sort of put into your pocket. Now, he then really, I think, set the scene for what has become an important conversation about projection. Because in cartography, a map projection is, there's more than one way to flatten the globe's surface. And so projections are this field coming from pure mathematics that talk about differential geometry, projective geometry, and manifolds. And so what we're talking about in terms of projections can be used in many ways. So we have the Mercator projection, which you can see in Google Earth, but there's a beautiful one which the United Nations uses called the azimuthal equidistant projection. That's what it uses for its emblem, which was created by Abu Rayyan al-Biruni around about 1,000 years ago. So look at the projection and you'll see there's a whole history behind that. Now, knowing where you are is a key aspect of connecting knowledge, but also making and interpreting observations is very important. Some of the most contentious debates in science have then been about the way that observations are interpreted, the most famous of which, of course, was the Oxford evolution debate at the British Association annual meeting in 1890. So this was about how people were interpreting observations of all of life. And the debate is remembered mostly because of this big exchange between Bishop Wilberforce, who was a brilliant speaker, and Thomas Huxley. The debate is sort of anecdotally reported. There were no minutes, unfortunately. But the question that raised it up into the public eye was when Wilberforce supposedly asked Huxley whether it was through his grandfather or his grandmother that he claimed to be a descendant of a monkey. And Huxley said that he would not be ashamed to have a monkey for his ancestor, but he would be ashamed to be connected with a man who used his great gifts to obscure the truth. So you can imagine what kind of a discussion was to follow. And there was a whole discussion around whether or not they said it or not. There were so many different reports on this. But what this did was it demonstrated how important the accurate observation and then its interpretation was to be. Now, the debate, of course, came from the work of Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species, published in 1859, together with Wallace. And everyone had a view on it, essentially. Small groups clustered around, became proponents of the origin, others didn't. And eventually, and slowly but slowly, as the readings of these of the different versions and different ideas came together and more evidence came together, we have, of course, what we see today, which is really a dialogue between conservation, creationism and evolution. Because if you want to consider that the world was made in a very short period of time, then, of course, you have a very different view about conservation as opposed to one which is about evolution. So you can read all about that in the paper, in the lecture notes that I've given. Let me then move on, because one of the challenges was getting sort of well-documented observations into useful knowledge. And so I would just like to spend a moment with Darwin, because of course he's known for his work on the origin of species. And of course, Fitzroy, when he knew afterwards in the Oxford debate how Darwin had been using his time on the ship, he was absolutely furious. He said, he would never have taken him if he had known that the observations would lead to the origin of species and evolution. Much has been written about finches and so on, but I want to talk about fishes, because I actually was working for a while in Cambridge, and I had the pleasure to work in the library. And one of my colleagues who was working on the Darwin project was very frustrated. He couldn't read Darwin's handwriting. He showed me some of it. And I was really shocked because I could just read it. It was just like my father's writing. My father was in the medical profession, and it literally looked like little squiggly lines with dots on it. So I then I took on the role of the interpreter, the transcriber of some of Darwin's notebooks. And I was particularly interested in the zoological notebooks and the Spirits of Wine, where he documented the fish that he had captured. What is absolutely extraordinary about his notebooks, and because I was trained as an ichthyologist, I was really, really keen to see what he had in them. And I could not believe how accurate, how detailed his descriptions. In fact, they were so good that you could identify the specimens from his description, his written description, without looking at pictures and without even having the specimen in your hand. And this was just as well because, as the curators in the British Museum said, when they kept receiving these crates with glass jars and alcohol in them, that he clearly wasn't very good at preserving specimens, because quite often the jars would arrive as a mush of sort of alcohol, tissues and bones. But his notebooks were fantastic. And if you have a chance to read a book called Darwin's Fishes, you'll find the descriptions in the back of that where I transcribed them. What was also nice was that in the notebooks and diaries are little sketches, and already you can see that he had sketched the phylogenetic tree with anecdotes. I found particularly captivating a little sketch that he'd done in Tierra del Fuego of a picture of a woman's breasts. So it was at the top of a torso with two breasts and two nipples on it, and he'd labelled them titties, and then he deleted it and called them mammary glands. It was almost as if he knew someone else was going to read his notebooks. So he did some editing for that. Very sadly, though, going back to the notebooks, the notebook which has got the evolutionary tree diagram has gone missing, most probably stolen from the library in Cambridge. So there's a call out for its return. So let's hope that returns, that happens. Now, more or less at the same time as Darwin was engaged with the Beagle work and his subsequent research at Down House, we see Wallace. Wallace, a British naturalist, explorer, geographer, illustrator. He went to the Amazon River. He went to the Malay archipelago. He identified something called the Wallace Line, a very important faunal division between Australia and the Asian origin. And he was independently able to conceive the theory of evolution through natural selection. And in fact, his paper on the subject was jointly published with some of Charles Darwin's writings, which then prompted Darwin to publish the book on the origin of species. Now, most crucially, Wallace was another father. He was really considered to be the later father of biogeography, a worthy successor to Buffon. And he also discovered many other things, for example, warning coloration in animals. And he reinforced the hypothesis about how natural selection could contribute to speciation by encouraging the development of barriers against hybridization. Now, Wallace was always attracted to unconventional ideas like evolution, and that really did strain his relationship with the scientific community. But he did a number of things. He wrote a book called Man's Place in the Universe in 1904, and it was really the first serious attempt by a biologist to evaluate the likelihood of life on other planets. And in fact, he was one of the first scientists to write a serious exploration of whether there might be life on Mars. But apart from his sort of very perceptive views on sort of evolution, he really was a fantastic observer. And his works called In the Malay Archipelago was both popular and highly regarded. And it's never been out of print since 1869. So that just goes to show what an amazing observer and writer he was. But he didn't have any family wealth, and so he had a lot of financial difficulties in his life, and he had to really support himself by selling specimens that he'd collected. So he didn't really do very well. He got a very small government pension at the end because of Darwin, who helped him. But what I think this demonstrates is that two explorers, scientifically trained, went to different parts of the world. Wallace to the Malay area and spent time there. Darwin in his travels all around, particularly in Galapagos and Latin America and so on. They came from two separate comparable sources of data and showed through argumentation and the scientific method that you would have a common idea about evolution. And that's really at the core of knowledge. Being able to compare results and demonstrate similarities and differences is how we can see that this connected knowledge has helped us to understand life on planet Earth. But in addition to trained scientists, we have some fabulous writers in the sort of library of how we describe the world. And three really, I think, stand out. One is the Reverend Gilbert White, his book, Natural History and Antiquities of Selborne. We've got Henry D. Thoreau's Walden on the life in the woods. And the Pulitzer Prize-winning writer Annie Dillard's Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. These three, using allegorical, simple, non-technical language, have really provided the bridge between the worlds of science and literature, but have actually contributed because of their apparent ability to take on the detail of life and really bring that to life. When we think about Wright's writings, again, one that's never been out of print and one which Darwin and many others were heavily influenced by, the natural history that he described was explicit and was very good, but he wrote about evidence with a very high level of empathy. So he had 40 years of observations, recognized birds and animals, thinking they must have inner lives, but his recording was accurate, although haphazard, and he put together diaries together with another person, William Marwick, collecting records and then looking at species in Hampshire and in Sussex. And the data, for example, on plants were really the beginning of what we call modern phenology. So this accurate description of processes in the world was done no better at that time than by White. So he didn't have grand theories, he didn't plan experiments, he didn't replicate them as we do in the modern scientific world. He was sort of more freewheeling than that. But he was one of the first people and one of the first writers to show that you could really write in a fresh and intensely personal way without sacrificing precision. So there's a quote here I could read. During this lovely weather, the congregating flocks of house martins on the church and tower were very beautiful and very amusing. When they all flew off together from the roof on any alarm, they swarmed in the air, but they soon settled again in heaps on the shingles, where preening their feathers to admit the rays of the sun, they seemed highly to enjoy the warm situation. So I think genuinely we have wonderful sort of precedents here. What was important, though, about White's contribution was how it then got taken up by the Audubon Society, and that bird census, which is so widely promulgated around the world, was originally coming out of Gilbert White's books and his ideas. So he was the first to perceive the value of the study of migration, for example, and of banding or ringing birds. So in a way, no professional ornithologist ever did as much to widen interest in birds as did Gilbert White. The next one I want to look at is Henry Thoreau, his Walden, which is a simple reflection on life in natural surroundings. It's part of his personal declaration of independence, I guess, a voyage of spiritual journey, a spiritual discovery, and about self-reliance. And it's really what happens over the course of 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days in a cabin that he built near Walden Pond. What is tremendous about it is that he has captured precise scientific observations of nature, as well as metaphorical and poetic uses of natural phenomena. He identifies numbers of plants and animals, and he immersed himself in nature so that he became, in a sense, the icon of many of the conservationists, being able to describe precisely dates, the freezing and the thawing of ponds, and creating experiments that he mounted himself on the sort of the shape of how the pond influenced the freezing and the thawing. And in a similar way, Annie Dillard's work, the years spent at Tinker Creek, Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, was precisely that. She created 4 sections. She almost made it like a scientific journal, because she was talking about flora and fauna. But really, I think the citation that she's given by the Pulitzer Prize jury, who nominated her at the age of 25, where they said she's an expert observer in whom science has not etiolated a sense of awe. Her book is a blend of observation and introspection, mystery and knowledge. We unanimously recommend it for the prize. So let's move on now. We're thinking about how knowledge is described, how it's captured, the beauty of nature. In February 2015, the Obama administration committed a lot of money, $3.2 million, towards saving the monarch butterfly. Environmental activists were deeply concerned by the effect of climate change on that. And at the same time, there's a book by Barbara Kingsolver called Flight Behavior, which became the cause célèbre. And there's a whole backstory about whether the American scientist who's named in this, Ovid Byron, is in fact the president, Obama, even down to his own initials. But what is interesting is that this miracle of when the butterflies arrive in a place called Feathertown, they think that this is somehow God sending light to lift their threadbare lives. But the beauty was very deceptive because the butterflies are in fact climate refugees, and that's really what the book is all about. So the monarch butterfly, in a sense, became iconic for this story of how climate was affecting the natural world. And interestingly, it got picked up much earlier through the idea of Ed Lorenz, a wonderful scientist who worked on chaos. He actually contributed to the theory to chaos theory through his work on weather systems. And this idea of the metaphorical butterfly effect, a sensitive dependence on initial conditions, where a small change in one state of a deterministic system can result in large differences in later stages. Lorenz's work was instrumental in opening up a conversation about the predictability of weather and whether it really is possible, given that small changes could happen. But what captured the public's imagination was the statement that the simple flap of a butterfly in the Amazon was able to sort of send off a different set of scenarios for our future. And really, in a way, that public imagination and awareness about predictability being inherently limited is something that's, I think, carried us forward. And you see a lot of the pictures, as you can see in the slide, how the similarity of the trajectories from the mathematics actually have come full circle because they actually look like the butterfly's wings. None of this would have been possible, though, without the advent of journals, of publicizing scientific discoveries. I mean, in earlier days, Kepler, Galileo, and many others, they made claim to discoveries where they described them in papers coded in anagrams or ciphers, and then they would distribute them to smaller groups in these coded texts. And the idea was to keep those discoveries into something that they could profit from. They didn't want to reveal it, and they wanted to prove ownership, so they would kind of keep it to themselves. So this system was totally connected to your patron and how you would actually find your way through your life, where your patron, as well as yourself, wanted to really capture and have the publicity. But as aristocratic patronage began to, I would say, go down, but also cease to provide enough scientific funding, and as funds then became more and more provided through things like the Royal Society and even through governments, where there was recognition to different scientific organizations, then, of course, scientists had to publish their results. And whilst it's difficult to see in the future where this is going to go, what we have observed is that there's been a huge benefit. So that we can see, and many institutions understand, that holding technology and the benefits of not holding are very clear, so that the cost of withholding is far greater than actually sharing. And this is essential. Where we are today with open science is really that movement to make scientific research, including publications, data, samples, and software, and its dissemination available to all levels of an inquiring society: amateur, professional, citizens, other scientists. And this practice has just simply taken off. This desire of scientists to have access to shared resources has really led to more transparency and accessibility. And in fact, even though we don't have a framework for it, one is coming through UNESCO, and we hope we can formalize that. We see again and again this campaigning for open access. So today we have amazing examples of open science. We've got the Darwin Tree of Life project at the Wellcome Sanger Centre, which aims to sequence the genomes of all 60,000 species of eukaryotic organisms in Britain and Ireland. We've got genomic data helping us to really understand evolution of the diversity of life. And this whole picture is really brought to the fore as we consider what's happened in COVID, because of course open science has meant that we have been able to access publicly information that is vital to all of our futures. But it's not quite so simple, because open science isn't possible without the World Wide Web as we know it, and then of course now the semantic web, which is enabling us to use reasoning and computers to use data in all different kinds, in text, in numbers, in images, and in videos. And that unstructured and structured data really can be explored in a completely different way using something called ontologies. And ontology engineering is important. Its use goes right back to Parmenides, through Plato, Aristotle, all the way through to many philosophers. And it's part of the metaphysical world, metaphysics, which we see as being vital to understanding how knowledge is shaped, but also how we can drill down and use questions from one category of endeavor and essentially investigate others. So ontologies and ontology engineering is about supporting development of fields in genomics, geography, chemistry, and environment, using computers then to create language and formal representation of concepts that allow you to link, using knowledge graphs, concepts from one area, data from another area, and bringing those together. This means that when we manage large databases from, for example, the human genome, from satellite data, we have to process that, but not just by simply, lots and lots of computing power. Now we use our intelligence, using rich semantics to think about how and what's important inside videos, inside text, and inside different papers that we've been publishing. For example, we can also use it to remove word sense disambiguation. In the Sustainable Development Goals, I was leading a team to create the ontology, the meta-ontology for them, because we had the word access in many goals, and using the word access for education, for clean water, for health, very, very different. And so we had to unravel what the word access meant in all these different domains. And that's really what ontologies help you to do. That, of course, then underpins artificial intelligence, because artificial intelligence benefits by helping communications amongst diverse users. It allows you to track and analyze trends in different areas and to see how all of the things connect together. So today we have ontological modeling. It helps cognitive AI and machine learning, but it also helps people to put their knowledge into a sort of classified way, just like Linnaeus did and just like Buffon and others did in their biogeography. Now, just as well we have all of this, because along comes the need for gene ontologies, where we've got to cross across the biggest spectrum of organisms out in the wild, creating zoonoses, pools of diseases, which then move into the human population, which then spreads around the world with all that different demography and all that different genetic profiling. And the gene ontology allows us, it's one of the most successful and widely used biomedical ontologies, because it allows you to structure information that's coming in and to, in a sense, anticipate some of the challenges that COVID, for example, has presented us. So what COVID has done has shown the power of open science and open data, combining domain-specific ontologies with artificial intelligence-driven tools. And this has allowed this huge international collaborative effort to sift through all the relevant data, uncover new data patterns and trends, converging on even the dashboard developed by Johns Hopkins, supported by the WHO, and all those data flows coming in from countries to tell us what's happening now, but what's the connection between a mutation emerging here with a particular gene sequence, its source, its epidemiology, its rate of transmission, and so being able to alert people very quickly about new variants, changes in spike proteins, and transmissibility. None of this would have been possible without open science, without ontologies, and without sharing the knowledge that we have connected around the world. So the future, as we've seen, is very different. We're entering a new era of scientific research and knowledge, one where we've underlined the importance of open science. We've underlined the importance of open data, sharing data, not putting it away in coded books. And in fact, this era presages a future where public knowledge about planet Earth is going to be radically transformed, because people will be able to access, analyze for themselves, maybe simulate and combine large, complex data sets from a huge array of instruments, satellites, interdisciplinary research programs, citizen deliberations, and all kinds of people getting engaged. And it is this which holds the key to the future of our planet. Thank you.